started like any other road trip. I was on my way from Denver to the Grand Canyon, just me and my 2006 Jeep Grand Cherokee. I'd been planning the trip for months, but now that I was finally on the road, there was something in the air that felt off. The first few hours were nothing out of the ordinary. I drove through miles of nothing but desert landscapes, the kind you'd expect, with the sun beating down and the sound of the tires humming against the pavement. But it was when I hit Route 66 that things started to take a strange turn. I'd pulled into a small, barely noticeable town somewhere in Arizona, the kind of town that doesn't show up on many maps. My phone had no signal, and I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The kind of desolate place that makes you wonder what exactly you're doing there. I stopped at a gas station, an old, rusty place that looked like it hadn't been renovated in decades. There was a man behind the counter, his face hidden in shadow. He barely glanced up when I entered. "Need anything?" he asked, his voice gravelly and low, almost like he hadn't spoken in years. I grabbed a drink, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. As I paid, I asked him if there was anywhere interesting to check out around the area. He didn't answer right away, just stared at me. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, he muttered, "There's a road. People usually don't come back from it." I gave him a confused look, unsure if he was joking, but the look in his eyes told me otherwise. He didn't explain further, but as I left the store, I couldn't shake off the thought of that road. I had to know. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe I was just looking for a detour to make the trip more exciting. But something told me to take that road. I drove for miles, deeper into the desert, until the world seemed to fade away. The road became rougher, less maintained, and the sun began to set. A strange feeling washed over me, like something wasn't quite right. I ignored the prickling sensation on the back of my neck and kept driving, thinking it was just my imagination. But then, the lights in my rearview mirror flickered. I glanced back, nothing. I swore I saw headlights, but when I looked again, the road behind me was empty. That's when I first noticed it. The noise. It started low, like a soft humming sound, almost like a whisper in the wind. It was coming from the direction I was headed. At first, I thought it was just the car, maybe something rattling in the engine. But as I drove further, the sound grew louder, clearer, almost like a voice calling out to me. And that voice, it wasn't one I recognized. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgent. Desperate. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the side of the road. The desert stretched out in every direction, and for a moment, all I could hear was the wind. I checked the rearview mirror again, but the road behind me was still empty. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the road, just barely visible in the fading light. Person. Or at least that's what I thought at first. It was hard to tell, the way they stood completely still, motionless like a statue. But the longer I stared, the more I realized. This was no ordinary person. There was something wrong. I quickly started the engine and drove off, my heart pounding in my chest. The humming sound, the voice, the figure, everything felt wrong. But that wasn't the worst part. As I sped away, I saw something else in my rearview mirror. The figure. It was following me, not on foot, but moving faster than any human could. I didn't think. I just floored the gas pedal, feeling the Jeep surge forward, kicking up dirt and gravel as I tore down the road. The humming in my ears grew louder, sharper, almost like a distorted song echoing through the night. The figure behind me, whatever it was still there, growing closer with every passing second. I glanced in my rearview mirror again, but all I saw was a blur of movement. It wasn't a person anymore. It was something else. Something faster, fluid, inhuman. I could see its shape, a long, shadowy outline that flickered in and out of the dim light. The air around it shimmered, like it was distorting reality itself. I had to get out of there. I told myself I was just imagining things, that it was some weird desert mirage, or maybe my eyes playing tricks on me after hours of driving. But as I turned the corner of the road, I saw something that made my stomach drop. An old, abandoned car off to the side. It was a dusty, wrecked sedan, completely rusted out and half sunk into the sand, as if it had been left there for years. But there was no way I was stopping. I had to keep going. Suddenly, the humming stopped. Just like that. Silence. I was confused at first. Had it just been my mind? But then, out of nowhere, a loud crash echoed from behind me. I jerked the steering wheel, narrowly avoiding what looked like a person? No, it was a shape. A human-like figure, hurtling straight into the side of my Jeep. It didn't leave a mark. It didn't even feel real. But I swear, I heard it scrape against the metal, like nails on a chalkboard. My breath quickened, my hands tight on the wheel, knuckles white. I didn't dare glance behind me now, but I knew whatever was following me wasn't done yet. I saw something else, a sign. Faded, cracked, barely legible. It read, "Dead end." No, this couldn't be happening. I couldn't let myself be trapped here. Panic surged, and for the first time, I realized I wasn't just being chased by some crazy person. This thing was toying with me. I swerved sharply, the tires screeching as I veered off the road onto a rougher dirt path. The desert was endless, with nothing in sight but the dimming horizon. The wind whistled past the Jeep, and all I could hear was the heavy thump of my heartbeat in my chest. Then there it was again, the figure. It appeared in front of me, blocking the path. I slammed on the brakes, but it wasn't fast enough. I felt the jolt of impact before I even had time to scream. The Jeep skidded to a halt, the headlights illuminating the figure in front of me. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs stretched and angular, like it wasn't made of flesh at all. Its skin was dark, almost shadow-like, and there was something grotesque about the way it moved. Its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were nothing more than hollow black pits. I didn't dare to move, couldn't even breathe. The creature, whatever it was, towered over my car, its head tilted to one side, as if it were studying me, waiting for me to make the next move. Then it reached toward the Jeep. I don't remember how I reacted. I just know that I didn't want to die in the desert, alone, with something like that reaching for me. Without thinking, I put the Jeep in reverse, flooring the gas again. The tires screeched against the dirt as I slammed into reverse, but the thing wasn't far behind. I could hear it moving, its eerie, unnatural speed closing in on me once more. I didn't have much time. I had to get out of there. I threw the Jeep into drive again, aiming straight for a gap in the fence nearby, an old barbed wire gate, barely standing. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest I thought it might burst. The moment I broke through the gate, I could hear the thing screech, a sound that made my blood run cold. I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was getting out of that hellhole. I didn't stop until the sky had completely darkened, the faintest flicker of distant lights ahead. But even then, I didn't feel safe. I knew it was still out there. I thought I'd escaped. For a moment, I really did. The lights in the distance were small, but they felt like a promise. A beacon of safety after the nightmare I had just fled. I drove through the night, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. I could feel the sweat on my palms, the thudding of my heart still echoing in my ears, even though the creature had vanished from my view. I passed through a few small towns, but everything seemed off. The houses were dark, abandoned-looking, and the streets were completely deserted. It was as if the whole world had fallen asleep, leaving me alone with whatever nightmare I had encountered. But it wasn't just the emptiness that bothered me. It was the strange feeling of being watched. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to rest. But after hours of driving, I had to. My eyes were heavy, and the road seemed to stretch on endlessly in front of me. I pulled into a small motel just off the main highway. The neon sign flickered above the entrance, its weak glow casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. It wasn't much, but it was enough for me to get some sleep, to calm my nerves. When I stepped inside the office, there was a woman behind the counter, her face pale and drawn. She didn't seem surprised to see me, which only made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw something strange in them. Something cold, like she knew exactly who I was, even though we'd never met. "You driving alone?" she asked, her voice smooth but with an edge to it, like she was expecting something, or maybe even waiting. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just need a room for the night." She handed me a key without another word. I took it, not bothering to ask if there were any other guests. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to sleep and forget all of this. The room was small, dusty, and smelled faintly of mildew. It wasn't ideal, but at least I was away from that road. I locked the door behind me and set my bags down on the bed. The moment I sat down, though, that strange feeling returned, the sense of being watched. I chalked it up to my nerves, my exhaustion. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the sensation. The wind outside picked up, howling like a distant storm, and I could hear the faint rustling of something scratching at the window. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was almost like something was trying to get in. I forced myself to get up and check the window. Nothing, just the empty, barren road stretching out into the night. I shook my head, trying to push the fear back down. It had to be the paranoia, the stress of the day catching up with me. I went back to bed, pulling the blanket tight around me, trying to close my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Then, in the silence of the room, I heard it again, a soft scratching sound. This time, it was coming from inside the room. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs as I listened. There was something moving, something shifting in the dark corners of the room. I glanced toward the bathroom door. It was barely cracked open, but I swear, I saw something move behind it. I couldn't tell you what it was. It was just a shadow, but it was there, and it was watching me. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a lamp, and slowly approached the door. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face whatever was inside that room, but I couldn't just lie there pretending nothing was happening. I swung the door open, my hands shaking. There was nothing. The bathroom was empty. I breathed a sigh of relief, though I could still feel the eyes on me. I turned to leave, but as I glanced back into the mirror, I saw it, behind me. A figure, tall, unmistakable. That same shadowy outline I'd seen earlier, back from the desert. It wasn't just a reflection. It was standing right there in the corner of the room, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I screamed and stumbled backward, falling into the corner of the bed. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, and then spoke. "Why did you leave?" I tried to get up, to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I felt paralyzed, trapped in that room, suffocating under the weight of its presence. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure was gone. I looked around, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The room was empty once more, but the terror didn't go away. I could still feel it. I could still feel it. I had to get out of there. I didn't care how late it was. I didn't care if I was driving through the night. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? After what I had seen, felt, there was no way I could rest. I grabbed my things, shoved them into my bag without thinking, and rushed out of the room, barely sparing the motel clerk a glance. She didn't say a word as I passed her, but her eyes, they were different, cold, like she knew what was coming for me, and she had already accepted it. The Jeep's engine roared to life as I sped away from that motel, the headlights cutting through the thick darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get as far away from that place as possible. I drove for hours, not caring about the route, just wanting to get away. But the deeper I went into the desert, the more I realized I was still being followed. It wasn't just the sound of the wind this time. It was the faint hum again, like before. But this time it was closer, much closer. And it wasn't coming from behind me. It was in the Jeep, all around me, in the air. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the engine or the radio malfunctioning. But I knew better. The hum was too deliberate, too intentional. The highway stretched out before me, endless and empty. I passed another small town, this one even more desolate than the last. But it wasn't the town that caught my attention. It was the man. He was standing on the side of the road, just like the figure had been before. But this time, there was no mistaking it. He wasn't a shadow. He wasn't a trick of the light. He was a man, a real person, or at least I thought he was. I slowed down, unsure whether to stop or keep going. There was something strange about him. He was just standing there, facing the road, motionless, as though waiting for something. His clothes were old, worn down like they'd seen better days. But what really struck me was his face. His eyes were wide open, but there was nothing behind them. Blank, hollow. As I passed him, I swear I felt his gaze on me. Couldn't look away. I had to force myself not to. And then, just like that, he was gone. It happened so fast. 1 second he was there, and the next vanished into thin air. I looked in my rearview mirror, but the road was empty. No sign of him, but the hum, the presence, it didn't fade. It stayed with me, gnawing at my mind, even though I had no idea what was causing it. I started seeing other things in my peripheral vision. Flickers of movement, shapes that shouldn't have been there. Figures that appeared and disappeared as if they were always just out of reach. And that same voice from earlier, the one I'd heard in the desert, started whispering to me again. It wasn't clear, but it was familiar. Come back. I tried to block it out, but it kept coming. Louder, more insistent. Come back. We're waiting. I slammed my foot on the gas, trying to outrun it. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it more than I ever had before. I was being pulled back, but I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to face whatever was chasing me. Whatever it wasn't human. It was something older. Something that had been there long before me and would be there long after. The further I drove, the more I realized I wasn't alone anymore. It was like the desert itself had come alive, surrounding me. The land was alive with whispers, with eyes in the dark, watching my every move. I had crossed some line I couldn't come back from. I don't know how long I drove. The miles blurred together, the world outside the Jeep felt unreal. The only thing that mattered was the road in front of me, and the thing that was still out there, watching me. Then I saw it again. The figure. It wasn't just one this time. There were several all around me, standing motionless at the edge of the road. As I approached, they moved. Slowly. But their movements were unnatural, jerky, like they weren't fully human. Their limbs twisted in ways they shouldn't. Their faces were blank, empty. I tried to stop. I needed to get away. But as I slammed on the brakes, my Jeep skidded to a halt. The hum. It was deafening now. It filled the air, vibrating through my skull. I looked around, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. All I could do was stare as the figures closed in. And that's when I understood. I wasn't driving away from it. I was driving toward it. I had been the one being pulled all along. I couldn't move. It was as if my body was frozen, like the fear had seeped into my bones, locking me in place. The figures surrounding me weren't just standing still anymore. They were coming closer. They didn't walk like humans. It was more like a glide, a slow, deliberate drift through the air, moving toward me with an unnerving calmness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, tight, as if the very air around me had thickened. The hum was louder now, ringing in my ears. It was coming from them, from the figures, their voices blending into one continuous, rhythmic pulse. Come back, the whisper echoed through my mind, louder this time, more insistent, more desperate. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of the Jeep, to drive, to do anything, but my feet were glued to the pedals. My hands wouldn't leave the wheel. The Jeep was no longer mine. It was theirs. The first figure reached the door. It was a man, tall, gaunt. His face stretched impossibly thin. His eyes were black, not the empty void I had seen before, but solid, inky blackness that swallowed any light. He leaned in through the window, his face inches from mine. The air in the car grew colder, his breath fogging the glass, and I could see the faint outline of his twisted, skeletal hand reaching toward me. I closed my eyes, expecting the worst. But instead of touching me, I heard a voice. The same voice that had whispered to me, only now it was clearer, sharper. You shouldn't have come. You were always meant to be here." The words hit me like a physical blow. Meant to be here? What did that mean? My mind raced, trying to understand. This wasn't a random road trip. This wasn't just a series of bizarre events. This had all been leading to this moment. From the very first mile I'd driven down that cursed road. And then it hit me. The truth. The realization that had been hovering just out of reach the entire time. I hadn't been driving towards safety. I hadn't been escaping anything. I had been following a path. A path that led to them. The figures. The road. The desert. I was part of it now. A part of something ancient. Something far older than I could ever comprehend. The hum. The voices. The figures. They had been waiting for me, watching me, pulling me into their world. It wasn't just the desert that was alive. It was the land itself. There were places like this, scattered across the country, where the fabric of reality had torn, where the world bled into something else. A place where lost souls, restless spirits, or whatever you wanted to call them, existed in a state between life and death. And now I was one of them. The figure's hand was at the door now. It was cold, freezing, and I could feel its presence even before it touched the handle. It was coming for me, but it wasn't to hurt me. It was pulling me in, claiming me. I could feel my own pulse racing, my body trembling as the realization settled in. I had become part of this nightmare. But just before the figure touched the handle, something strange happened. There was a crack, a flash of light, and then silence. The figures stopped. For the first time since I'd encountered them, they froze, staring at something in the distance. Something that wasn't me. Something else. I couldn't move, but I could feel it. A presence. Another force far stronger than the figures, far older. The air around me thickened, the temperature dropping drastically. The Jeep's engine sputtered, struggling, as though it were being affected by the overwhelming presence. The figures began to scatter, retreating back into the darkness of the desert, their strange, unearthly movements fading away. But the force didn't leave. It was still there, lingering in the air, close enough that I could feel it pressing against my skin. It wasn't the same as the figures. It wasn't a whisper, a voice, or a hum. It was something far more powerful. Something that wasn't just in the desert. It was part of it. Part of the world itself. I had to leave, but I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, weighed down by the presence that now surrounded me. And then the light began to fade. Slowly, like a sinking sun. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring into the emptiness, but eventually, my body broke free from the paralysis. My hands moved, shaking uncontrollably, and I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal. The Jeep lurched forward, its tires spinning as it tore through the dirt road. I didn't look back, couldn't, but the hum, the whisper, it didn't stop. Followed me. I could hear it, just behind me, as I drove into the night, the road stretching out ahead. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. I had survived, for now. But that desert, those figures, they were still out there, waiting for the next lost soul to wander in. And I would never be free. I thought I had escaped, but there's no escaping something like this. Something ancient. Something woven into the very fabric of this place. The road stretched before me, empty, desolate, and endless. The headlights of the Jeep illuminated nothing but the path ahead, and the only sound was the tires on the asphalt, the hum that still buzzed faintly in the back of my mind. I drove for what felt like days. No signs, no towns, just the wide, open desert that seemed to go on forever. I kept my hands tight on the wheel, my eyes fixed on the road, but every few miles, I would glance in the rearview mirror. Each time I would see the same thing, nothing. Just the darkness, as if I was the only one left in the world. But I knew better. I knew I wasn't alone. That's when I saw it. A faint light, flickering in the distance, out of place in the empty expanse. It was too far to make out clearly, but it was a beacon, a promise, or a warning. And it wasn't the first time I'd seen something like it. I pulled over, my heart racing in my chest. The air was thick with anticipation. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sat in the Jeep, staring at the flickering light. Part of me wanted to ignore it to keep driving, but something inside me told me I had no choice. I had to know what it was. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel beneath me, and walked toward it, drawn like a moth to a flame. The night was still, the only sound my footsteps. The only thing that kept me from completely losing my mind was the gnawing sense that I was doing what I had been destined to do. As I got closer, I realized the light was coming from an old gas station, the same kind of place I had stopped at before at the beginning of this nightmare, the same place I had left behind, thinking I could outrun it all. The station was old, run down, with broken windows and a faded sign hanging above the door. It didn't make sense. There was no reason for it to still be standing here, in the middle of nowhere with no signs of life. And yet, there it was. The door creaked open on its own as I approached, a sound so loud it sent a jolt of fear through my spine. I stepped inside, and the air felt different, colder, heavier. It was almost as though the room was breathing, the walls pressing in on me. And that's when I saw him, the man behind the counter. It was the same man who had been at the gas station the first time I'd passed through. His eyes were still hidden in shadow, his face unreadable, as if he had been waiting for me all along. "You came back," he said, his voice low and gravelly, just like before. "I knew you would." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just some random road trip. This was the end. The road had been leading me here all along. I had crossed a threshold, a point of no return. The man smiled then. It wasn't a friendly smile, but a knowing one, as if he understood everything that had happened. And then he said something that chilled me to my core. "You were always meant to be here. You are part of the road now." I looked around in horror, the weight of his words sinking in. The road, the desert, the figures, the hum. It wasn't just a place. It was a living thing, and it had claimed me. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. The flickering light outside went out, plunging the gas station into darkness. I tried to run, to escape, but the air had thickened again, pressing in from every side. I turned to face the man, but he was gone. And in the darkness, the hum grew louder, closer, more deafening than ever. I was never supposed to leave. The road had always known I was coming, and now I was part of it. Did you like these stories? Write in the comments. And please write what you didn't like. It will be useful for me to know your opinion. And I will improve my work. Thank you. Subscribe to my channel and click the bell so as not to miss new stories. I try for you.